Stay quiet. Don't move. I whispered to a man I had no business speaking to, a man whose presence had already turned the entire room into something heavier than air. And even now, I can still hear the way the glass in my hand trembled as I leaned in like I was just another waitress doing her job. Because 6 hours earlier, everything had been normal, or at least my version of normal. The kind where your feet ache after a double shift, and the smell of seared steak clings to your clothes no matter how many times you wash them. And the only thing you worry about is making rent before the end of the month, not whether someone is about to change your life forever. My name is Emily Carter, 24 years old, working at a high-end restaurant in downtown Chicago where the tips are good and the customers never look you in the eye. And that night started like every other, with dim lights reflecting off polished marble floors and the quiet hum of expensive conversations floating through the air, until he walked in, Dominic Hayes, though I didn't know his name yet. Only that the room shifted when he stepped through the door, like everyone subconsciously made space without being told, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, and his eyes, cold and focused, scanning everything like he was always 3 steps ahead of the moment. And I remember thinking he didn't belong in a place like this. Or maybe it was the place that didn't belong around him, because something about him felt controlled, dangerous in a way that didn't need to be loud. And I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on refilling glasses and memorizing orders. But then I noticed something else, something small at first. Another waiter I didn't recognize, his posture just slightly off, his movements too stiff, like he was acting instead of working. And I've worked enough shifts to know when someone doesn't belong. And my stomach tightened when I saw his hand, not steady, not relaxed, but tense. Fingers curling around something hidden beneath the tray. And that's when it hit me, not as a thought, but as a feeling, sharp and immediate, like my body understood before my mind did. And without thinking, I moved, stepping closer to Dominic as if I was about to pour water into his glass, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. And I leaned in just enough for my voice to reach him without carrying beyond. Stay quiet, don't move, I said, barely louder than a breath. And for a second I thought he wouldn't listen, because men like him don't take orders from people like me. But then his eyes flicked toward mine, and in that instant something shifted, something unspoken passing between us. And before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed his sleeve and pulled, just as the room behind us seemed to fracture into chaos. And when he caught my wrist, his grip firm but controlled, those cold eyes locked onto mine, searching, calculating, not scared, never scared. And that's when he spoke, low and steady, like none of it had surprised him at all. "Why did you just save my life?" he asked, and I realized right then, standing there with my pulse racing and my world unraveling, that I had just stepped into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. His hand did not let go of my wrist right away, and I could feel the steadiness in his grip, not panic, not confusion, just control, like everything that had just happened was already being processed and filed away in his mind. And that scared me more than anything else, because people around us were still reacting, voices rising, chairs scraping against the floor, the soft glow of the restaurant now flickering with tension instead of comfort. And yet he stood there like the center of it all, untouched by the chaos, his eyes still locked on mine as if I was the only variable he had not accounted for. And I realized I had not answered him. Not really, my breath still uneven, my heart refusing to slow down. Because how do you explain something you did not plan, something that just happened, something your instincts forced you into before logic had a chance to catch up? So I swallowed and said the only thing that felt true. I saw something wrong. And even as the words left my mouth, they sounded too small for what had just happened, too simple for the weight of it. But he did not interrupt, did not dismiss me. He just studied me, his gaze sharp, searching for something deeper, something I was not even sure I understood myself. And then he finally released my wrist, slowly, deliberately, like the decision meant something, like letting go was not automatic for him. And that should have been my chance to walk away, to disappear back into the safety of being invisible. Just another waitress in a room full of people who never remembered my name. But my feet did not move, and neither did his, because now everything had shifted. The space around us no longer just a restaurant, but something else entirely, something I did not have a name for. And I noticed then the way the other men in suits had repositioned themselves, subtle but intentional, forming a quiet perimeter, Their attention not on the room anymore, but on him, and on me. And that was when it hit me fully. I was no longer outside of whatever this was. I was in it, whether I wanted to be or not. And the thought sent a cold wave through me. Because people like me did not step into worlds like his and walk away unchanged. And I took a small step back, instinct finally catching up, my voice quieter now. I did not mean to get involved. And for a second I thought that might be enough, that he might nod. Let me go. Let this become something I could convince myself had not really happened. But instead he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something far more complex than my words. And when he spoke again, his voice was even lower, controlled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. You already are, he said, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a simple statement of fact, like gravity or time, something that existed whether I accepted it or not. And I felt my chest tighten, because part of me knew he was right, knew that the moment I leaned in and whispered those words, the moment I chose to act, I had crossed a line I could not uncross. And before I could respond, before I could even decide what I wanted to say, one of the men stepped closer to him, murmuring something under his breath, too low for me to catch, but I saw the shift in Dominic's expression, not surprise, not fear, but recognition, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. And then his attention returned to me, sharper now, more focused, and I felt it like a weight, like standing under a spotlight I had never asked for. You saw more than you should have, he said, not as a question, and my throat tightened because he was right again. I had seen enough to know that something had been planned, something precise, something deliberate, and I had interrupted it without understanding the consequences. And for the first time since all of this started, fear settled in properly, not the sudden jolt from before, but something deeper, quieter, the kind that stays, because this was not just a moment, not just an accident. It was the beginning of something, and I had no idea how far it would go, or what it would cost me. And as I stood there, caught between the life I knew and the one I had just stepped into, I realized there was only one thing I was certain of. He was not going to let me walk away like nothing had happened. I should have walked away the moment he said that, should have nodded and retreated into the blur of movement behind me, back to the safety of trays and orders and a life that made sense. But my body stayed exactly where it was, like something had rooted me to that spot, and the longer I stood there, the more I could feel it, the shift in how people looked at me, not as a waitress anymore, but as something else, something they could not quite place. And that was when I understood the real problem. It was not just that I had seen something I was not supposed to see, it was that he had seen me see it. And that made me part of whatever came next, whether I agreed to it or not. And the thought settled heavy in my chest as Dominic took a slow step closer, closing the distance I had tried to create, not aggressively, not rushed, just enough to make it clear that space between us was something he controlled now, not me. And I could feel the faint trace of his presence, the quiet authority that seemed to follow him like a shadow, and I forced myself to meet his eyes again, even though every instinct told me not to, because looking away felt like surrender, and I did not even know what I would be surrendering to. I did not tell anyone, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, and it was the truth. I had not had time to tell anyone, had not even fully processed what I saw myself. But he did not react immediately, did not nod or dismiss it. He just watched me like he was measuring the weight of my words, like he could tell the difference between fear and honesty. And after a moment he spoke, that is not the problem. And something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because it meant there was a problem, one I had not even considered yet. And before I could ask what he meant, one of the men beside him shifted again, speaking quietly into a small device at his collar, his tone calm but urgent. And I noticed the way the exits of the restaurant were no longer just exits. They were controlled, watched, and that realization sent a quiet ripple of unease through me, because places I used to see as open suddenly felt closed, and Dominic followed my gaze for a second before returning his attention to me. The person you noticed, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. He was not supposed to be there, and the way he said it confirmed everything I had felt earlier, that instinct that told me something was off, something that had pushed me to act without thinking. And now that instinct felt less like luck and more like a responsibility I had accidentally taken on, and I shook my head slightly, trying to push that thought away. I just work here, I said, almost to remind myself as much as him. because I needed that to still be true, needed to believe I could step back into that version of my life. But his expression did not change. If anything, it sharpened, like he had just reached a conclusion. Not anymore, he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not loud, not dramatic, just certain, and I felt a flicker of frustration rise up through the fear, because I did not like the idea of someone else deciding what my life was or was not. Even if that someone was him, you do not get to decide that, I said before I could stop myself, and for a brief second there was silence between us, the kind that stretches just enough to make you question whether you went too far. And then something unexpected happened, something small but unmistakable. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something that looked almost like interest, like I had said something he did not hear often. And that unsettled me in a completely different way, because it meant I was no longer just a problem to solve. I was something he was paying attention to, and that felt far more dangerous. And then he stepped back slightly, breaking the tension just enough to make it clear the moment had changed again. And when he spoke this time, his voice carried a different weight, more final. "You are coming with me," he said, not as a demand shouted across a room, but as a quiet decision already made. And everything inside me resisted, every part of my normal life pushing back against the idea of leaving with a man I did not know into a world I did not understand. And yet when I glanced around, at the controlled exits, at the watchful eyes, at the way the room no longer felt like a place I belonged, I realized something I did not want to admit. Staying was no longer an option either. And for the first time that night, I understood that the choice I thought I had might never have existed at all. I did not move right away, even after he said it. Even after the weight of his words settled into the air between us like something final, because a part of me was still holding on to the idea that I could say no, that I could step back and reclaim the version of my life that existed just minutes ago. But the longer I stood there, the more that idea felt like a memory instead of a possibility. And I could feel it in the way the room had changed, not loud, not obvious, but controlled, like everything was being quietly managed behind the scenes. And I realized this was not chaos, not really. It was order, just not the kind I was used to, and Dominic was at the center of it, not reacting, not questioning, simply directing without raising his voice, without even appearing to give commands. And that scared me more than anything else, because it meant this was not new to him. This was his world, and I had just stepped into it without permission, and I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly. But every thought kept circling back to the same point. I was no longer safe pretending I was just a waitress, and when I finally looked back at him, really looked this time, I saw something I had missed before. Not just control, not just power, but calculation layered with something else, something quieter, like he was already planning 3 moves ahead, and I was now part of that plan whether I liked it or not. "If I go with you," I said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered, because it did. "What happens after that?" And for the first time since this started, there was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration, like the question itself was worth acknowledging. And he studied me again, that same intense focus that made it impossible to hide behind anything. And when he answered, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "You stay alive," he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else, because it was not a promise of comfort, not reassurance, just a statement of priority. And I realized then that whatever world he lived in, survival was not assumed. It was earned, protected, controlled. And somehow I had just become something he intended to protect. And that thought should have felt safe. But it did not entirely. Because protection from someone like him came with a cost, one I did not yet understand. And I hesitated, just for a second, my instincts pulling in 2 directions, one telling me to run, to get out while I still could, and the other reminding me of everything I had already seen, everything I could not unsee, and how leaving might not mean escape at all. It might mean being alone in something I did not know how to survive. And that second instinct won, quietly but completely, and I nodded once, small but certain, and something in his expression shifted again. Not surprise, not relief, just confirmation. Like this was the outcome he had expected all along. And he turned slightly, not away from me, but forward, like the next step had already begun, and one of the men moved closer, not touching me, not forcing anything, but guiding, subtle and controlled, and I followed because at that point there was nothing else to do. And as we moved through the restaurant, I noticed how everything seemed to part just enough to let us pass. Conversations lowering, eyes avoiding direct contact, like everyone understood something I did not, like they knew better than to get involved. And I felt the weight of that as we reached the exit, the heavy doors opening before we even stopped, and the night air hit me instantly, cool and sharp against my skin, a stark contrast to the controlled warmth inside. And for a second I paused on the threshold, looking back over my shoulder at the place that had been my entire world just hours ago. The tables, the lights, the routine I had memorized down to the smallest detail, and it felt distant already, like something I had outgrown without realizing it. Or maybe something that had simply ended without warning. And when I turned back, Dominic was already watching me, not impatient, not rushed, just waiting. And there was something about that, about the fact that he did not push, did not need to, that made the decision feel even more final. And as I stepped forward into the night, into whatever came next, I realized one thing with a clarity that settled deep in my chest. I had not just left my old life behind. I had walked directly into his, and there was no going back. The car door closed behind me with a soft, final sound that felt louder than anything inside the restaurant, like a line had been drawn and I had just stepped over it. And for a moment, I just sat there, hands resting in my lap, trying to slow my breathing as the world outside the window blurred into passing streetlights and reflections, because everything had happened so fast that my mind was still catching up. Still trying to understand how I went from balancing trays and counting tips to sitting in the back of a black car next to a man who spoke about survival like it was the only thing that mattered. And I could feel his presence beside me even without looking, steady and controlled, like the movement of the car did not affect him at all, like he existed on a different rhythm than the rest of us. And that made it harder to ignore the reality of where I was, because silence filled the space between us, not uncomfortable, not awkward, just deliberate, like he was giving me time to think, or maybe watching to see what I would do with it. And I finally turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at him. And he was already looking at me, not surprised, not caught off guard, just aware, always aware, and I looked away almost immediately, my pulse quickening again under the weight of that attention. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, but it still felt loud in the enclosed space. And he did not answer right away, which somehow made the question feel heavier. Like the destination was not just a place, but something more. And when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost neutral, "Somewhere safe," he said. And I let out a small breath I did not realize I was holding, even though I was not sure what safe meant anymore. Not in his world, not after everything I had just seen. And I leaned back against the seat, staring out the window as the city shifted around us. Familiar streets turning unfamiliar the farther we went, the glow of storefronts fading into quieter neighborhoods, and I realized I had never really thought about what existed beyond my routine, beyond the places I knew, because my life had always been small, contained, manageable, and now it felt like it was stretching into something I could not map, something I could not control, and that thought made my chest tighten again, because control was the one thing I had always relied on, even when everything else was uncertain. And now it was gone, replaced by his decisions, his direction, his world. And I turned back toward him, forcing myself to ask the question that had been building in my mind since the moment I stepped into the car. "Why me?" I said, and this time there was no hesitation in his response, no pause, like he had already considered it, already decided. "Because you saw it before anyone else did," he said, his gaze steady. "And you acted." And something in the way he said it made it feel like more than an observation, like it meant something in his world, something I did not fully understand yet. And I shook my head slightly, frustration mixing with fear. "That does not make me special," I said, and he held my gaze for a second longer before responding. "It does where I come from." And the simplicity of that answer lingered in the air between us, because it told me everything and nothing at the same time. And I realized then that in his world, people did not act without reason, without calculation, and the fact that I had done something instinctively, something unplanned, made me unpredictable, and unpredictability was something he either valued or controlled, and I was not sure which one I had become yet. and the car slowed slightly, turning onto a quieter street lined with tall buildings that looked nothing like the ones I was used to, their entrances guarded, their windows dark, and I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like we were entering a space that operated under different rules. And when the car finally came to a stop, I hesitated again, my hand hovering near the door handle, because stepping out would mean accepting this fully, not just following along but becoming part of it. And before I could decide, his voice cut through my thoughts, low and certain. "You are already in," he said, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the truth of that settle, because he was right. I had been in since the moment I chose to act, and as I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet, controlled night, I realized something that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear. This was not just about staying alive anymore. It was about understanding what I had just stepped into, and whether I could survive becoming part of it. The building in front of me did not look like anything I recognized. Not a restaurant, not an apartment, not even an office in the way I understood it. It stood taller, quieter, its glass reflecting the city lights without revealing anything inside, like it had nothing to prove and nothing to show. And I hesitated at the curb, the cool air brushing against my skin as if reminding me I could still turn around, still pretend I had gotten into the wrong car, made the wrong choice. But the presence beside me made that thought fade before it could fully form, because Dominic had already stepped out, already moving toward the entrance without looking back to see if I followed. And somehow that made it harder not to, like he did not need to check, because he already knew I would be there. And after a second that felt longer than it should have, I moved, my steps slower, more cautious, my eyes taking in every detail as the doors opened before we even reached them, not by chance, not automatic, but intentional, someone inside already aware of our arrival. And that realization settled into me quietly. This was not a place you just entered. It was a place that knew you were coming. And the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted again, the outside world cutting off behind me as the doors closed, leaving only the soft echo of our footsteps against polished floors and the low hum of a space that felt controlled down to the smallest detail. And I could not help but notice how everything seemed precise, from the lighting to the placement of furniture, nothing out of place, nothing accidental. And it made me more aware of myself, of the way I still wore my work uniform, slightly wrinkled, slightly out of place in a world that looked like it had been designed with intention. And I felt it then, the difference between where I came from and where I was now, not just in money or appearance but in structure, in power, in control. And it made me shift slightly, uncomfortable in a way I could not explain, and Dominic slowed just enough for me to catch up, his presence close but not overwhelming. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again. But this time it felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for something, and I finally broke it, my voice quieter in the large space. "This is where you live," I said, not quite a question, and he glanced at me briefly before looking ahead again. "This is where I work," he replied, and something about that answer made my thoughts pause, because it meant this was not just his home. It was something else, something bigger, something that extended beyond him. And before I could ask anything else, we reached a set of doors at the end of the hall, darker, more solid, and they opened with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, revealing a space beyond that felt even more private, more controlled. And I stopped just inside, my instincts pulling me to stay aware, to take in everything I could, because I did not know what I would need to remember later. And Dominic turned slightly toward me, his expression unreadable but focused. "You are safe here," he said, and I nodded automatically, even though the word safe felt different now, less about comfort and more about conditions. Like safety here depended on him, on his decisions, on his rules. And that realization made me straighten slightly, grounding myself in the only thing I could still control, my own thoughts, my own choices. "And what happens if I want to leave?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I needed to know, needed to understand if I still had that option. And for a moment he did not answer, his gaze steady on mine, not cold, not distant, but deliberate, like he was deciding how much truth to give me. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then you leave," he said, and something in me eased slightly at that, until he added, "But not tonight." and the small sense of control I thought I had found slipped again, replaced by the quiet understanding that even when choices existed here, they came with conditions, and as I stood there, in a place that felt both secure and unfamiliar, I realized something that settled deeper than fear, deeper than uncertainty. I was no longer just reacting to what was happening around me. I was starting to learn the rules of a world I never meant to enter, and the more I understood, the more I could feel it changing me in ways I was not ready to face. The word tonight stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing in the quiet space around us as if it carried more meaning than just time, because in his world nothing sounded temporary unless it was meant to lead into something permanent, and I could feel that subtle shift again, the sense that every answer he gave was only part of something bigger, something I was still trying to piece together, and I took a slow step further into the room, my eyes adjusting to the softer lighting, the kind that did not need to impress but still managed to, everything in place, everything intentional, and I realized there were no personal touches here, no signs of comfort or warmth, just structure, function, control, and it made me wonder what kind of life required a space like this, what kind of person chose it, and whether that choice had ever been optional for him. And I crossed my arms slightly, more out of instinct than cold, grounding myself in something familiar. So I stay here, I said, not quite asking, just confirming what I already understood, and he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not forceful, just enough to make it real, and I let out a breath I had been holding without realizing it, because staying meant time, and time meant I could think, could understand, could maybe find a way to navigate this instead of just reacting to it. And that thought gave me a small sense of control, fragile but present, and I moved a little further into the space, my steps slow, deliberate, taking in the details. The way everything seemed quiet but not empty, like there was always something happening beneath the surface, something I could not see yet, and I turned back toward him, watching the way he moved, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, like every step had already been decided before he took it. And I realized then that this was not just confidence, it was experience, the kind that comes from living in a world where hesitation has consequences. And that realization made me study him more carefully, trying to understand what I had stepped into by stepping into his path. And before I could stop myself, I asked, "Does this happen a lot?" And he paused slightly, not because the question was difficult, but because he was choosing how to answer it. And when he spoke, his voice was even, controlled. "No," he said, and something in the way he said it made me believe him, not because it was reassuring but because it was precise, like he did not waste words on anything unnecessary, and I nodded slowly, processing that, because if this was not normal, then tonight had been different for him too, not just for me. And that thought shifted something inside me, just slightly, because it meant I was not the only one dealing with something unexpected, and I glanced around again, the quiet of the room settling deeper now, less intimidating, more defined, and I realized I was starting to adjust, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to notice the change, and that realization both steadied and unsettled me at the same time, because adapting meant surviving, but it also meant becoming something I had not planned to be, and I turned back toward him, my voice quieter now, more measured. "The person who did that," I said, careful with my words. "They knew you would be there." And he met my gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he said, and there was no denial, no attempt to soften it, just the truth, and I felt a chill run through me, not from fear but from understanding, because that meant this was not random, not chance, it was planned, intentional, and I had walked into the middle of it without knowing, and I swallowed, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces I did not want to connect. "So they were close to you," I said, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, not in his posture but in his eyes, something colder, something more distant, like a door closing behind a thought he was not ready to share, and he did not answer right away, which told me more than words could have, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, closer than they should have been, and the weight of that settled between us, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not just about danger, it was about betrayal, and betrayal meant trust had existed first. And I felt that realization settle deep in my chest, because it changed everything, not just for him, but for me too. Because if someone close enough to reach him could turn, then no one in this world was exactly who they seemed to be. And as I stood there, in a place that felt secure, but built on something far more fragile than I had imagined, I realized that saving him had not just pulled me into his world. It had pulled me into a truth I was not prepared to face, and I had no idea what it would cost me to learn it. The word betrayal did not leave the room when he said it. It stayed there, settled into the space between us like something alive, something that changed the air itself, and I felt it in the way my chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from understanding. Because betrayal meant history, it meant trust had been given before it was taken, and I realized I was standing in the aftermath of something that had started long before I ever walked into that restaurant. And Dominic did not look away from me after he said it, did not soften it or explain it further. He just let it exist, and somehow that made it feel more real than if he had tried to hide it. And I shifted my weight slightly, my arms still crossed, holding on to that small sense of grounding as my mind tried to keep up. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter, not because I was afraid to speak, but because the question itself felt heavier, like it carried more than just curiosity. And he did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was deciding how much of the truth I was ready to hear. And when he finally spoke, his tone was steady, controlled. "Now we find out who thought they could stand behind me and not be seen," he said. And something about the way he said it made it clear this was not about anger or reaction. It was about certainty, about correction, about restoring something that had been disrupted. And I felt a small chill run through me, not from what he would do, but from how he thought. Because in his world, nothing was left unresolved, nothing was ignored. And I realized then that I had stepped into something that did not end quickly, something that moved forward until it was finished. And I swallowed, my thoughts racing ahead of me again. Because if he was going to find that person, if he was going to uncover something that deep, then being here, being with him, meant I would see more than I ever wanted to. And the realization made me hesitate, just slightly. "And me," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, because I needed to understand my place in all of this. And his eyes shifted again, not colder, not harsher, just more focused, like the question mattered in a different way. And when he answered, his voice was quieter than before. "You stay where I can see you," he said. And the simplicity of it made my breath catch for a second, because it was not a request, not a suggestion, it was a boundary, one that had already been set without my input. And I felt that familiar flicker of resistance rise up again. The part of me that refused to be defined by someone else's rules. "Even now, even here, I am not part of this," I said, more firmly than before. And for a brief moment the silence that followed felt different, sharper, like the room itself was listening. And Dominic did not react immediately, did not argue or correct me. He just watched me. And there was something in his expression I had not seen before, not amusement, not irritation, but something closer to recognition, like he understood the need behind my words even if he did not agree with them. And after a second he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "You became part of it the moment you chose to act," he said. And I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to say something that would pull me back out of this. But the words did not come, because deep down I knew he was right, not in the way that made me feel trapped, but in the way that made everything make sense. Because I had chosen, even if it was instinct, even if it was unplanned, I had made a decision, and decisions have consequences, and standing here now was one of them. And I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing, just slightly as I accepted that truth, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to stop fighting it for the moment. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the control or the distance, but at the weight behind it, the responsibility, the structure, the way he carried everything without showing it. And I realized something that shifted my perspective just enough to matter. He was not just protecting himself. He was protecting something larger, something built over time, something that could be broken from the inside. And that was what tonight had been about. Not just survival, but exposure. And I felt that understanding settle into me quietly, because it meant this was not going away, not for him and not for me. And as I stood there, in a place that felt both safe and uncertain, I realized that the question was no longer how I got here. It was what I was going to become now that I was. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt like a line had been drawn somewhere I could not see, and I was standing right on it, aware that one step in either direction would change something I could not undo. And I stayed still, not because I was frozen, but because I was thinking, really thinking for the first time since this started, not just reacting, not just trying to keep up, but actually asking myself what I wanted to do with all of this. And that question felt heavier than anything else that had happened tonight, because it meant I had a choice, maybe not about being here, but about who I would be while I was. And I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting away from him for a second as I looked around the room again, taking it in differently now, not just as a place I had been brought to, but as a place I might have to exist in, at least for a while. And I noticed things I had missed before, small details, the way the lighting was softer near the edges of the room, the way nothing was cluttered, nothing left to chance, and it reminded me of something I could not quite place at first until it clicked. This place was built on awareness, on control, on always knowing what was happening and why, and I realized that was the opposite of how I had lived my life, where most things just happened and I adjusted as I went. And maybe that was why I was still here, because I had acted without overthinking, and in his world that kind of instinct meant something. And I turned back toward him, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before. "If I stay," I said, not as a question, but as a statement I was testing out loud, "then I am not just staying to be watched." And the words surprised me a little as I said them, because I had not planned them, but they felt right. And for a second there was that same silence again. But this time it felt different, not tense, not sharp, but attentive, like he was listening in a way that mattered. And his eyes held mine, not dismissing, not interrupting, just waiting, and I felt something shift inside me, something small but real, the part of me that refused to be reduced to a situation instead of a person. And I continued, my voice gaining a little more strength. "I saw something tonight that you did not," I said, and I did not say it with pride or challenge, just as a fact. And his expression changed slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see, a subtle narrowing of his gaze, a focus sharpening, and I knew then that I had his full attention, not as someone who needed protection, but as someone who might have value. And that realization steadied me more than anything else had, because it gave me a position, even if it was small, even if it was temporary, and I held that thought as I spoke again. "So if I stay, I want to understand what I am part of." And there it was, the line I had just stepped over, not forced, not demanded, chosen, and the room seemed to hold that moment with me, the quiet stretching just long enough to make me aware of how much I had just risked by saying it, because I did not know how he would respond, did not know if this was something he would allow or shut down immediately, and for a second I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had misunderstood the boundaries of this world completely. But then he moved, just slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to shift the space between us again. And when he spoke his voice was calm, but there was something new in it, something I had not heard before. "Understanding comes with responsibility," he said, and the words settled into me slowly, because they were not a warning, not exactly, but they carried weight, like he was offering something and making sure I knew the cost before I accepted it. And I nodded once, not because I fully understood what that responsibility meant, but because I understood enough to know that it was real, and I was already involved whether I liked it or not. And for the first time since this started, I felt something different settle into my chest, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet kind of determination. The kind that comes when you realize you cannot go back and the only way forward is to choose how you move. And I met his gaze. Again, holding it this time, not looking away. And that was when I saw it clearly, not just the control or the calculation, but the recognition, like he was seeing me differently now, not just as the girl who had acted on instinct, but as someone who had decided to stay standing instead of shrinking back. And I realized then that whatever came next, whatever this world demanded of me, I was no longer just trying to survive it. I was starting to step into it, and that might be the most dangerous choice I had made all night. His words did not feel like a rejection, and they did not feel like permission either. They felt like something in between, like a door that had been unlocked but not fully opened. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting that settle, because I understood what he was really saying. That understanding his world was not something casual, not something you observed and walked away from. It was something that stayed with you, something that changed the way you saw everything. After, and I realized that I had already started to change, even if I did not want to admit it yet, and I shifted my weight slightly, my arms dropping to my sides as I took a small step forward, not toward him but into the space itself, like I was testing the ground beneath me, seeing if it would hold, and it did, quiet and steady, just like everything else here, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, accepting the weight of what I had just asked for, and what it might cost me later, and when I looked back at him, I saw that same focused attention, but there was something else there now, something more deliberate, like he had made a decision of his own, and that realization made me straighten slightly, because whatever came next would not just depend on me anymore. It would depend on what he allowed. And he took a step toward me, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to shift the space between us again, enough to make it clear that this was now a conversation, not just a situation. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried a different weight. "Then you start by listening," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard for a second, because I had expected something more complicated, more guarded, but instead it felt direct, almost instructional, and I nodded again, this time more certain, because listening was something I could do, something I had always done, even if I had never realized how much it mattered until now. And he turned slightly, his gaze shifting past me for a moment, and I followed it instinctively, noticing for the first time a subtle movement in the space beyond, a figure stepping into view from a distance, controlled, measured, and something about the way Dominic's posture adjusted, almost imperceptibly, told me this person mattered, not in the obvious way of power or status, but in a way that carried weight beneath the surface, and I felt my awareness sharpen immediately, my instincts kicking in the same way they had earlier, not from fear but from recognition, because this was how it started, this was how you learned, by noticing what others overlooked, and I stayed still, my attention shifting between Dominic and the approaching figure, watching for any change, any signal, any detail that might tell me more than words would. And Dominic did not look at me when he spoke again, his voice lower now, more focused. "Watch carefully," he said, and something about that instruction made my pulse quicken, not from panic but from anticipation, because I could feel it, the shift in the room, the way the air seemed to tighten just slightly, like everything was aligning toward a moment that had not happened yet, but was already inevitable. And the figure drew closer, step by step, their expression composed, their movements precise. But there was something beneath it, something I could not name at first until it clicked into place, hesitation, not obvious, not enough for most people to notice, but just enough to matter, and my breath caught slightly as I realized what I was seeing. The same kind of imbalance I had noticed before, the same subtle misalignment that had led me to act without thinking, and I felt that instinct rise again, stronger this time because now I understood what it meant, and I glanced quickly at Dominic, wondering if he saw it too, but his expression had not changed, still calm, still controlled. And that was when I understood something else. He was not looking for the same things I was. His world operated on different signals, different patterns, and for the first time since I had stepped into it, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had something he did not, something that did not come from training or power or control, but from instinct, from observation, from being outside of it all. And that realization settled into me with a quiet certainty, because it meant I was not just here by accident anymore. I was here for a reason, even if neither of us had fully said it out loud yet. And as the figure finally stopped a few feet away, the silence between them stretching thin with something unspoken, I felt it again, that same moment before everything changes, and I knew, without needing to be told, that whatever happened next would decide more than just tonight. It would decide where I stood in this world, and whether I was ready to take the next step into it. The man stopped just a few feet away, close enough for me to see the details clearly now, the precision in his suit, the controlled way he held himself, and yet that small inconsistency was still there, that almost invisible hesitation in the way his shoulders settled, like he was carrying something heavier than he wanted to show, and I felt it immediately, the same quiet signal that had pulled my attention earlier in the night, the same instinct that had told me something was wrong before anything actually happened, and my pulse picked up again. Not from fear, but from recognition. Because I knew what that feeling meant now, I understood it in a way I had not before, and I stayed still, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to observe without reacting. just like Dominic had told me, to listen, to watch, to learn, and the man spoke first, his voice calm, measured. "You asked for me," he said, and there was nothing unusual in the words themselves, nothing that would stand out to anyone else. But I watched the way Dominic responded, the slight tilt of his head, the pause that was just long enough to mean something, and I realized this was not just a conversation, this was a test, one that had been set in motion before I even knew I was part of it, and Dominic's voice came next, low and steady. "I did," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than the words themselves, because it told me he already knew something, already suspected something, and this moment was about confirmation, not discovery, and I shifted my focus back to the man, watching closely now, the way his eyes moved, the way his hands stayed just a little too still, like he was aware of being observed even if he did not know how closely, and I felt that instinct sharpen again, stronger this time, guiding my attention to the smallest details, the kind most people would miss, and I noticed it then, the brief flicker in his gaze when Dominic stepped slightly to the side, not a full reaction, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to matter, and my breath caught slightly because I understood what I was seeing, not fear, not exactly, but anticipation, like he was waiting for something that had not happened yet, and that did not belong in a normal interaction, not here, not now, and I glanced at Dominic for a fraction of a second, wondering if he saw it too, but his expression remained unchanged, controlled, unreadable, and I realized something important in that moment. He was not looking for what I was looking for. He was waiting for something else entirely, something deeper, something that required time, and that meant my role here was different. I was seeing the surface shifts, the immediate signals, the things that happened before anything else, and that realization steadied me, grounding me in the one thing I knew how to trust now, my instincts. And the man spoke again, continuing whatever explanation he had been called for, his tone consistent, his posture controlled, but I could hear it now, not in the words but in the rhythm, a slight imbalance, like he was choosing his phrasing more carefully than necessary. And I felt that quiet certainty settle deeper in my chest, the same certainty that had pushed me to act before, and I knew, without needing proof, that something about him did not align, something was off, and I did not know the full picture, did not know the details or the reasons, but I knew enough to recognize the pattern, and I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to draw a breath, just enough to decide, because this was the moment, the one that would define whether I stayed on the outside of this or stepped further in, and I glanced at Dominic again, this time holding his gaze for a second longer, and for the first time since this started, I saw it clearly, not just control, not just calculation, but awareness, like he knew I had seen something, like he was waiting to see if I would act on it again, and that realization hit me harder than anything else had tonight, because it meant this was not just about him testing the man in front of us, it was about him testing me too, seeing if I would trust what I felt even when I could not explain it. And I felt my heart steady, my thoughts clear in a way they had not been before, because the hesitation was gone now, replaced by something stronger, something certain, and I leaned just slightly closer to him, not enough for anyone else to notice, my voice barely above a whisper as I spoke. "Something is wrong." And the words felt familiar, almost like they had been waiting to be said again, and as soon as they left my mouth, I knew there was no stepping back from this moment, no returning to who I was before, because this time I was not acting on instinct alone, I was choosing it, fully aware of what it meant, and whatever came next, whatever this world demanded from me, I had just taken another step deeper into it. The moment the words left my mouth, everything shifted, not visibly, not in a way anyone else in the room would notice, but I felt it, the subtle tightening in the air, the way silence seemed to stretch just a fraction longer than it should have, and Dominic did not react immediately, which told me more than if he had, because men like him did not move without purpose, did not respond without intent, and the fact that he held still meant he was listening, not just to me, but to everything around us, measuring, confirming, aligning what he already knew with what I had just said, and I kept my posture steady, my expression neutral, even as my pulse picked up again, because this was no longer just instinct, this was something else, something I had stepped into willingly. And the man in front of us continued speaking, unaware or pretending to be unaware, his voice even, his words carefully chosen. But now that I had seen it, I could not unsee it, that slight delay before he answered, that almost imperceptible shift in his stance, like he was adjusting to something only he could feel. And I realized then that whatever he had planned, whatever role he thought he was playing in this moment, it was starting to slip, not enough to expose him completely, but enough to create a crack, and cracks were where everything began, and Dominic finally moved, just a small step forward. But it was enough to change the dynamic instantly, enough to draw the man's full attention, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Repeat that," he said, and the simplicity of the request made it more powerful, not an accusation, not a challenge, just a quiet demand that carried no room for refusal. And I watched the man carefully as he responded, the way his eyes flickered for just a second, the way his breath shifted. Slightly before he spoke again, repeating his explanation with the same measured tone, but now I could hear it clearly, the difference between the first time and the second, not in the words but in the rhythm, like he was correcting himself without realizing it. And Dominic listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but I could feel the focus in him now, sharper, more precise, like a lens narrowing in on a single point. And I realized this was how he worked, not through force or pressure, but through observation, through letting people reveal themselves in the smallest ways. And I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. Because for the first time since all of this started, I understood what my role was, not to act, not to interfere, but to see, to notice, to recognize the things that did not align before anyone else did. And the man finished speaking, his voice steady, his posture controlled, and the room fell quiet again. That same heavy silence returning, but now it felt different, like it was waiting for something. And Dominic took another step closer, just enough to close the distance between them, his presence filling the space without effort. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "You said something earlier," he said, and the man nodded slightly, too quickly, too eager to confirm, and I felt it again, that same imbalance, stronger now, clearer. And Dominic's gaze held his, unbroken, unyielding. "And now you said it differently," he continued. And there it was, not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a statement. But the effect was immediate. I saw it in the man's expression, that brief flicker of something he could not control, something that did not belong in someone who had been so composed just moments ago. And I felt my breath catch, not from fear, but from the realization that this was the moment, the one where everything shifted from uncertainty to truth. And Dominic did not press further, did not raise his voice or demand an answer. He simply held the silence, letting it stretch, letting the weight of his words settle. And I understood then that this was his strength, not forcing the truth out, but creating the space where it had no choice but to surface. And I stood there, watching it unfold, feeling the tension build in a way that had nothing to do with noise or movement, and everything to do with what was no longer being hidden. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything again. I was not just witnessing this. I had helped create it. My words, my observation, my choice to speak had shifted the direction of this entire interaction. And as the man struggled to maintain his composure under the quiet pressure of Dominic's gaze, I felt that truth settle deep in my chest, because it meant I was no longer just part of this world by accident. I was influencing it, shaping it in ways I did not fully understand yet. And that realization was both steadying and terrifying at the same time, because it meant there was no going back to being invisible, not after this, not after I had chosen to be seen. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like something fragile being pulled apart thread by thread. And I stood there watching it happen, feeling the shift ripple through the space without a single raised voice, without a single sudden move. And that was what made it real, because nothing about this moment needed force to be undeniable. It was already there, exposed in the smallest details, and the man in front of us knew it too. I could see it now in the way his posture held just a little too rigid, in the way his eyes no longer settled as easily, like he was searching for something that was no longer available to him. Control. And Dominic did not give it back, did not rush, did not press. He simply stood there, his presence steady, unyielding, letting the weight of what had been said do the work for him. And I realized then that this was not about proving anything. It was about revealing it, about letting the truth surface in a way that could not be denied or explained away, and I felt my breath slow, my thoughts clear, because for the first time since this began, I was not trying to catch up. I was right in the moment, understanding it as it unfolded, and the man finally spoke again, his voice still controlled but no longer perfectly balanced. "If there is something you are implying," he began, but the sentence did not land the way it was meant to. It lacked the certainty it should have carried, and Dominic interrupted, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to redirect the moment. "There is nothing to imply," he said, his tone even. "Only things that do not match." And the words settled into the space with quiet precision, and I saw it then, clearly, the way the man's composure faltered for just a second, the way his expression shifted before he could correct it. And that was all it took, not evidence, not proof, just a moment that did not belong. And Dominic stepped back slightly, not retreating but concluding, like the outcome had already been decided, and the tension that had built in the room shifted again, not disappearing but changing shape, becoming something more defined, more certain. And I felt it settle into me too, the understanding that this was the end of one thing and the beginning of another, not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. And the man lowered his gaze briefly, just enough to confirm what had already been seen. And when he looked up again, the dynamic had changed, not in power but in truth, and Dominic turned slightly, his attention moving away from him and back toward me. And that movement felt just as significant as everything that had come before, because it meant the moment was over, the test was complete, and now something else was beginning. And I felt his gaze on me, steady, measuring, but different than before, not just observing, not just assessing, but acknowledging. And I held that gaze, not looking away this time, not shrinking back, because I understood what it meant now, what I had done, what I had chosen. And the silence between us stretched for a second longer before he spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "You saw it again," he said. And I nodded once, simple, certain, because there was no reason to deny it, no reason to pretend otherwise. And something in his expression shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but I felt it, a quiet recognition, like a line had been crossed that could not be undone. And he took a small step closer, not imposing, not overwhelming, just enough to make the moment clear. "From now on," he said, his tone calm, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "You do not stand outside this." And the words settled into me slowly, not as a command but as a reality, and I felt it fully then, the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed. And I let out a slow breath, not resisting it anymore, not questioning it, just accepting the truth of where I stood. And as I met his gaze again, steady and unbroken, I realized something that felt both terrifying and grounding at the same time. I had not just stepped into his world, I had been seen by it, chosen by it. And whatever came next, whatever this path demanded of me, I was no longer just trying to survive it. I was part of it now, and there was no going back.